Okay, guys, so welcome to the second presentation here. We're going to be looking at chapter 2 of the um, Exploring Leadership text. And let me just organize some things here to share and we can get going. Of course, you can ask questions along the way so that you can organize things, get clarification. So I'm going to be doing this format. Is this okay with everybody? They can see the slides. I want to be able to see the list
Yes,
of.
sir.
Good. All right.
Yes,
So
sir.
today in chapter 2, we're going to be focusing our attention on sort of the emergence of leadership and leadership thought and the theories. I have a little video at the end that will probably summarize everything nicely. So we'll try and go through that for the evening. Hopefully, we'll be able to finish with some time left over. Okay. All right. So let's get going. So when we start looking at leadership at the very beginning, one of the perceptions or one of the ways in which people look at leadership is that it's something to be rewarded with. In fact, when we enter organizations, a lot of times people look to achieving positions of leadership to be able to acquire some degree of status, not only in terms of monetary status, but also in the concept of the idea of you know having something, since somebody asks you, where do you work? Well, I'm the manager of so and so, or I'm the CEO of this company, or I'm the supervisor in this region, or that type of stuff. It gives us some form of status. Now, if you are not a leader, how you look at leaders may vary based upon your perception of it. So some people are okay; they in fact they revere their leaders, and so other people just can't stand them. All right, and the observation made by McGregor Burns here is that leadership is probably one of the most observed phenomenons, but least understood. And that's quite true because, I mean, throughout the years, we've had so much people write about, publish, try to work out studies. This program now is one of the responses to trying to understand leadership and its capacity. So much so that there are tons of these programs all over the place. Are any of you all familiar with any of these? Have you seen these, participated in these
No,
leadership programs?
sir.
No? All right, so this one here, the DAFT, this is one of the textbooks we're looking at. Um, you might have seen these textbooks around, well, I should say textbooks, but this book around Seven Habits of Highly Effective People has been one of the more popular ones. In fact, I was actually took part in this program here as well. Should have seen this guy Tony Robbins in a lot of little clips all over the place. He's even made cameo appearances in films around in Hollywood. So lots of different programs. There was another program I did called the Leadership Challenge. That was out of uh, well, a lecturer from West Virginia came and delivered that for us. It was quite an interesting program. And there's even leadership programs for kindergartens. The Leader in Me, Great Happens Here. That program is one that is designed for what they call pre-K classes. I don't know if any of you all will understand that, but in the U.S. system, that's like our primary schools setups. So those are some if of a few programs that exist um, internationally in relation to welcome to the both modest um, the class. Bring this down. Let me come back up. All right. So those are the programs. Now, the what makes leadership so difficult is because one, it's not easy to define, and two, different people see leadership meaning different things. And then when we start to evaluate leadership and we begin to look at the context in which it's occurring, the variations in cultural attitudes towards leadership is something that also creates a problem for us to have what we could say uh, universal type of idea or definition for leadership. Because if you think about leadership primarily in Eastern culture, one of the things that you find happening, for those of you who like those old time kung fu movies, how do you see leaders being looked upon? Anybody here is a bit of a kung fu addict, or even anime? Yes, Christian. Okay, see a mic open but not hearing you. Might need to work on that. There. Anybody else? Anybody has an anime person?
So they kind of admire the leaders in a way. They aspire to be like them.
Yes, that's true. But how? What? Look at the way in which they refer to them. They always bow in their presence and refer to them
So they
sifu.
They
they
fear and
treat them with
respect
a
them.
sort of reverence.
Right. So they look upon their leaders in a form of reverence. Yes, Christian, you were adding something.
That they also fear and respect it as well.
Correct, yes. And that is something that you find in Eastern culture, whereas in Western culture, you might find that there's a degree of jealousy attached to it. People are very coveted. They covet the position, and therefore they look towards manipulating the situation so that they themselves can end up in a leadership position, and of course require that type of Eastern worship that they see coming out from them. So there are different ways in which different cultures look at leadership, but also different ways in which people view leadership across the board. You see it happening in a lot of circumstances. Now, regardless of how we see leadership, culturally or otherwise, what we want from our leaders is we want them to be able to provide answers for the problems that we face in a general form. So I've listed a couple of things that we're looking for guidance in: climate change, globalization, poverty, access to healthcare, education, and other public services. What do you see as some of the things that we are looking towards our leaders for? Anybody? What would you add to this list? Miss Makano. All right,
Well,
David. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Um,
Go ahead.
I would say right now in our country, I would say crime. We are look into our governments and stuff to help reduce the crime in Trinidad. So I would say that's a major one.
Yep, that's correct. I would agree with you as well. Anything else in our local environment besides what we have listed here? Anybody else can see anything else?
The corruption is our next one too.
Oh, well, the problem is the corruption. Um, hmm. But you're right. You're right about that because we're looking for leaders who are honest and would point out and eliminate corruption, um, especially the type that tends to hold up progress. So yeah, those are some things. Anybody else wants to add their 2 cents? No 2 cents? How about five
The
cents?
cost of living.
The cost of living, okay, yes, that's inflation. Yeah, we look towards our financial people, especially the Minister of Finance, to do things to help us in relation to that. So what happens though when they don't get it? They don't. They are either unable or unwilling to lead us through to some solution. Is that we start to develop a great amount of distrust in our leadership, and that in turn creates something called the anti-leadership vaccine. So let's examine what the author is trying to talk about here. So um, we have been plagued with crime issues in this country for I can't tell you how long now, decades now. We've been dealing with um, this issue and this problem of um, escalating criminal activity in the country, and it's not been getting any better. We've had pockets of improvements here and there, despite what police might be telling you, but generally, that feeling of being unsafe has been growing, and we feel as if it's gotten so large that it's gone beyond the ability of leadership to handle it, especially the political leadership. In fact, in a lot of instances, I think we even blame some of or put some of the responsibility for the situation with the leaders that currently exist. Would you all agree with that kind of assessment in terms of how generally people feel about the leadership in our current environment? Would you agree with some of those sentiments, or you're afraid to say so? Yes? No? Maybe? Hmm.
So can you repeat what you said? You broke up a little bit.
All right. What I was saying was that far too often we see not only are they not helping us through this criminal issue, but we sometimes see them as part of the problem, that they
Yes, sir. That's
promote,
true.
right? That they
That is
seem to
very true.
promote corrupt types of behavior, which contributes to it. So for a very long time, that has been part of the problem. Now, that in turn leads us into a type of behavior around it. So when leaders, I remember a couple of leaders went into communities and they were ridiculed by the community. I know one politician suffered from that really badly. Was or this guy, what's his name? Fitzgerald Hines. He has gone into the community that he's supposed to represent as an MP, and the people in those offices, they have I don't know if you all recall the incidents where they threw flood water in his face, and where he was but he's not the only leader who has gone back into his mainstay environment and been treated negatively by the people that he's supposed to represent. Why is that happening? Because they are not seeing him representing their interests, but rather he's representing the interests of other parties or other issues or other sets of groups of people in society and not their own. Now, what does that impact have on the next generation of leaders to follow? Well, when that happens, it makes people not willing to take up that challenge, especially people who might be better suited to the position. You find that they're dissuaded from doing that. That's why it's called the anti-leadership vaccine. And what we do find happening is that the people who then present themselves for the opportunity of taking up leadership positions, especially in the political environment, tend to be those individuals whose main feature is thick skin. They can handle the ridicule. They could walk away from it, but not necessarily walk away. They could deal with it by just simply ignoring it. But what happens in the long run is that the people who are probably better suited to solving the problems that we have walk away from the the positions because they're no longer willing to take up the problems that come with it. Because in that sorry, in that leadership position, you have to deal with the problems that you have to focus on. But with it comes the backlash of the society feeling it, showing its frustration against you, and not necessarily giving you a chance. You can't make mistakes in office. It's a whole host of things that discourages people who are the probably better individuals who have the skills to deal with the specific issues, to be unwilling to take up those positions. And that's something that I have seen happen time and again, especially when I start to look at the political candidates who make themselves available for elections. They don't necessarily focus on those people who are probably the better people, the more trustworthy people, but rather sometimes the shady characters are the ones who come up for things. So, and that's a unfortunate circumstance as a result of how we end up with the kind of leaders we do. So I know there's an old saying that says a society um, ends up with the leaders they deserve based upon that type of thinking and methodology that we talked about there. So, studies into leadership has indicated that there's still a number of myths to be dispelled, and the main thing is that the the main one of the main ideas is context is that it is important that we understand the context in which leadership is being practiced, simply because leadership practiced in a classroom environment is not the same type of leadership you will exercise in a social movement. Let's say you're part of let's say you're a teacher. First off, that's your profession, and you're teaching children of a particular age. Okay, guys, give me a sec. Let me just check and see what's going on. All right, guys, sorry about that. I have a visitor here, and it might make my dog a little anxious, so she might you might hear some noise. Okay, let's put it that way. So let's get back to where we were. All right, so we're talking about the myths of leadership, and the first myth that we need to, well, not myth, but problem that we have to think about is the context of leadership, which is where the leadership is taking place. So as I was drawing the analogy here, if you're in a classroom, there's one style of leadership, especially if you're dealing with children. There's a style of leadership that can work in that context. But you can't take that style and migrate it into a social. Let's say we are part of a group and you're the leader in the group that's dealing with, let's say, you like you know, church group or something like that, and you're pulling together youth group activities and stuff like that. The approach that you utilize in the classroom for the children cannot work in that circumstance, and that has been something that some people have problems with, and that they come from one background utilizing one form of leadership and try to migrate it into a new environment, but doesn't necessarily work. So that's one of the issues that we have to pay attention, because as we will find out, there are different forms of leadership, different techniques that are possible to be utilized. So there are things other than what we're talking about there to be utilized across the board. Some of the myths that we have to deal with: leaders are born, not made. Leadership is hierarchical. You need to hold formal positions, have status to be considered a leader. You must be charismatic to be an effective leader. There is one standard way of leading. It is impossible to be a manager and a leader at the same time, and you only really need to have common sense to be an effective leader. So let's tackle those. Let's deal with leaders are born and not made. This course wouldn't exist if this were true. But this sits upon a belief structure that was set early up in studies about leadership, that leadership was a function of genetics, and that there was some genetical type of markers that determine whether you're going to be a leader or follower. Of course, we are not going to buy into this. We are definitely of the thinking that leadership is not just about innate or characteristics that individuals are born with, but they are skills and attitudes that can be developed through training, through environment. So it's an argument of nature versus nurture, for those of you who might be familiar with that argument across the board. All right. So leaders, we definitely Leadership is something that can be learned, and it's not something that you're just born with and then you work with it from there. Now, leadership doesn't take place only in one level. In fact, most modern organizations try to decentralize leadership to make sure that there's leadership throughout an organization. So that's why you have, in especially in those pyramid form leadership models or organizational models, you create leadership lower down the rungs so that um, everybody takes responsibility for what they're doing throughout the organization. So you have different levels of leadership throughout. If, however, we only utilize leadership at a centralized point of view, the organization will tend to get static very fast because everything has to pass through that one individual, and it creates a sort of jam or bottleneck in decision making, and it slows the whole organization down. So different organizations utilize, especially progressive organizations, use multiple levels of leadership throughout the organization. It also helps with preparing people lower in the organization to take up higher level leadership roles throughout an organization. It's one of the succession planning techniques that is oftentimes utilized in the more modern organizational structures. Doesn't necessarily work in family oriented businesses. However, even in a family oriented business, you would want somebody who you have designated as picking up leadership positions, working their way through an organization to understand how exactly that organization works from bottom up. All right, so hopefully that will be something that we could look at. But it's one of the firm beliefs that it doesn't only occur at the top. In fact, leadership occurs all the way through an organization. Charisma. So, charisma is a trait that um, is tricky because charisma is an emotional response that we have towards somebody else. Charisma is not something that well, an individual could kind of prep themselves for charismatic leadership, meaning they can practice their speaking, they can practice their body language, they can ensure that they have a likable face, that they are pleasant to look at and to listen to. If you ever want to see somebody manipulate that, you could look at that film on, oh God, what was it called, boy? Um, there was a mini series done on the life of this person um, who tried to create this diagnostic medical equipment that required the use of a limited amount of your blood to determine a lot of things about you, in terms of, I think, it's different cancer research and all kind of thing. And they made millions of dollars for a period of time, and she patterned her leadership skills behind or after this gentleman, Steve Jobs. And she eventually was found out, of course, and ended up in jail and whatnot, being punished for it. But you can actually put on the airs of being charismatic and that type of stuff. And the funny thing about it is charisma is not something that you actually put on yourself, but is a given to you by other people. And because it's an emotional response, oftentimes what we've found is that because it's emotional in nature, a lot of people who have been ascribed charismatic qualities in their leadership have led us to do some very negative things. So, case in point, this quote from Peter Drucker, he talks about the three most charismatic people in the last century, inflicting the most amount of damage to the human race in that particular time frame: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Now, we've spoken about Hitler and we've spoken about Stalin before. How many of you all know who he's referring to when he says Mao? Anybody? No?
No, sir.
Who's his correct name is Chairman Mao. Does it ring a bell there now? In
No,
fact,
sir.
his
No, I didn't see
actions
it.
his actions in China led to even more people dying than in World War One. Sorry, World War Two. All right. Over his reign, Chairman Mao led the revolution of China and the conversion into the um, in the Chinese Communist Party. And during that period, there was a period of re-education and a period of the Great Leap Forward. I think that's what it was called, where there was a lot of painful things done to the population, and the vast majority of people who ended up dying under his watch were, in fact, citizens of China. They were starved to death. Some were just outright killed because they were seen as being uh, incorruptible or sorry, the word was trying to remember, but it
So
means yeah.
is that when they anybody who had anything from the Western society, they were the ones who were well, persecuted.
Yes, and eventually they were sent to re-education camps and so on. And if you couldn't take that re-education and you wouldn't give up your Western thinking, you were eventually, well, basically killed. And in that case, they had a lot of children teaching older people because the older people were the ones who had, of course, more entrenched Western views about freedom and that type of stuff, and free speech and those type of things coming from the society that they lived in. But the whole point would have been that that group of individuals were targeted for re-education, and Mao used to give the children of China the authority to make the corrections. So here we have the problem with charismatic leaders, of course, is that they can in fact lead us into good things, but oftentimes we find that they are negative in nature. So we've met two of these individuals already, one positive, one negative. We've talked about Hitler in the past in the last chapter, and we've talked about Martin Luther King. All right. Um, this individual here is anybody? Who's this guy?
Is that not Gandhi, sir?
Mahatma
Yes,
Gandhi.
Mahatma Gandhi. What change was he associated with? The British used to call him a thorn in a nappy. Anybody?
I think he was a lawyer, and he led protests, I think, against the British rule at the time.
Hmm. In fact, he was instrumental in moving India towards its independence. Because in India, independence wasn't something that the British wanted because India has a lot of resources that they wanted to extract before they actually started to agitate for the independence. And that actually started the sort of end of the British Empire kind of situation coming out of that circumstance. But he was very instrumental in that. In fact, is credited with it as well. Him and his entire family. He had a whole dynasty of children that followed him into politics, and interestingly, a lot of them were assassinated, just like he was. All right, curious of all. And then we have this gentleman here with the dark shades on. Anybody recognizes him? Charismatic leader in the United States. Might recognize him. He's the Reverend Jim Jones. Does anybody know what Jim Jones is famous for or infamous for?
He was a cult leader,
Uh huh.
and he had murdered people.
No,
No?
he didn't
He had
murder
a
anybody.
Okay.
Cult leaders don't murder people. Cult followers lead people into suicide, mass suicide.
Yeah, but I mean, it could be considered murder if you look at it.
Well, if you look at it, you'd realize how different that is. Because in Jim Jones's situation, he was able to convince people to willingly drink the Kool Aid. They believed what he said, and he was so charismatic in nature, he was able to convince these people that the U.S. Army was coming to get them. Remember, this took place. I don't know if you've ever followed the story of Jim Jones. There are countless films about it, so you could go and look at a film, any one of them, to get the backstory on all of this. But Jim Jones didn't have weak people. He wasn't leading weak people. He was actually leading a lot of middle class Americans, young Americans, especially those that were marginalized in the American society. So anybody that had any sort of criminal records, like anybody who was marginalized because of their race, they couldn't get jobs because of the way in which the economy was set up and the way in which the racism was sort of institutionalized. He was able to bring these people together. And much like another individual that comes to mind, anybody knows about the more later version of a cult follower called David Koresh. Anybody's familiar with him? And Texas Waco massacre, and the Branch
Yes,
Davidians.
sir.
Right, that one's more recent. Well, recent relative. All right, but you have a whole host of these small church people who rose to prominence, became a cult follower, was able to lead people off in these various directions, and then willingly convince grown people, educated people, to want to take their lives. And that was just the end result, huh? Um, Prior to that, it was Jim Jones would basically like the guy from the Branch Davidians, he would instruct the men that they had to stop having sex, they had to give up their wives and their female children to him to breed the next coming and all. It was, I mean, it's literally bending the mind of individuals around you, making them weak and tired, and allowing this person to do things that they weren't you wouldn't have done in the first place. I mean, and if you look at it from outside, you'd wonder why somebody just cough him down and beat the crap out of him, or something along those lines. Both him and that guy David Koresh. Look at some of those video or films that depict what took place during those things, because it has happened in the past and it will happen again, because there are people who have that charismatic appeal that we ascribe to them, and because we do that, we give them leeway into doing things well beyond what we think is acceptable, and that's part of the problem that comes up with charismatic leader. They Many accomplished leaders are not described as charismatic for every positive charismatic example we see negative ones. So that's something that we always have to pay attention to. We'll come back to charisma in a little bit, as well, as we will see later on. All right, so another myth is about there being one way to lead. There's not one way to lead. Leadership is as variable as the individuals that take up the positions, because the individuals are shaped by their gender, their cultural identities, their own personal value systems, where they've come from, their environmental factors that impact upon their ability to derive their personalities. One of the reasons why I'm asking you in one of the assessments to do your own self analysis, understand where you come from and what are the things that are likely to have developed you as an individual, but also in the context of you as a potential leader. All right. So there's not one way to do things. There's several ways to do things, and this is the situation that we wanted. So the myth of there being one way to lead is untrue, simply because not only do we have the leader themselves coming and approaching their leadership from different perspectives, we also have the context also determining that how leadership behaves. All right. So the other part here is about leadership and management. That the two don't coincide. So a manager is an individual who primarily is looking at achieving the objectives of an organization. So whatever they do, they are trying to manipulate or organize the factors of production available to them to be able to get the best output for the company or the organization, which includes, of course, making best use of the people that are available to him in the organization. So that is primarily what a manager does. But does it mean that you can't lead and can't be a manager at the same time? We will come across something called episodic leadership in a little bit. And this is what really is the focus here. Leadership is not something that you constantly have to engage in. Managers obviously are going to be preoccupied with making sure they do things the way the organization wants them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the way in which it ought to be done. So you see a distinction here. Managers are preoccupied with doing things the right way, accordingly defined by the organization, whereas leaders are focused on doing the right thing. And how do we get to that situation would be there if there's a variation between what the business thinks is right and what society thinks is right through the lens of the individual in a leadership position. But does that mean that an individual sitting in a managerial position can't act as a leader as well as a manager? The reality of the matter is that though that there are distinctions between the two, there are serious overlaps between the two. So therefore, what we find happening is that some leaders behave or act in managerial types of roles for some of the time, and other times they act in leadership types of roles. So think about it from this perspective. You go into the office, your supervisor is at work with you. They are in the office doing some stuff, preparing some minutes for meetings, typing up some reports. Those are not leadership activities. Those are operational activities. They are required for, the administrative functioning of the office. But when the leader calls you in to have a short discussion about a problem that you all are having in the organization, to get your feedback on a particular set of situations that's happening, that is leadership. That is the leader gathering information, seeking your advice, seeking your counsel, or simply seeking information to be able to make a better decision. Of course, they can communicate that to you in the form of a memo or discussion. So either from a verbal point of view or from a written point of view, you start to get instructions. And that type of activity helps with running the business and managing the people. How you feel when you come out the office is going to be a direct relationship or direct result of the nature of the communication. If you feel cheated, if you feel happy and content that you've been listened to and that you think something is happening towards your development, then those are the kind of things that we'd hope with a good manager will be able to achieve utilizing good managerial or good leadership techniques. Miss Rampasad. Oh, is that a... Yes, I think it is. We don't have another Rampasad here. Okay, so she's been dropping in and out, I take it. Is there somebody extra here that I didn't get in touch with? Do I have everybody? I have to try and make sure we have everybody. I don't know, we lost somebody. Okay, I'm muttering to myself. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so that's the distinction between managers and leaders. Yes, it can happen. And of course, the last thing about leadership being a teachable concept, again, we are of the firm belief that leadership is something that can be learnt and taught. You're involved in this course, so obviously there's going to be a situation where we're going to ask for the development of certain skills. We're going to examine certain things that we're going to be looking at. It's not just about common sense. There are actually some very specific things we have to look at. We have to get involved with, and you have a lot of self-examination to do. You have to be willing to learn from your mistakes if you want to take up leadership positions. It's something that you're going to be able to develop over time, have and learn through engaging in courses like this or engaging in other sorts of leadership developmental courses that might come along your way. Just reading books, understanding how other people did things in the past by looking at maybe the autobiographies and so on. That helps you to understand the motivations behind people and why they did what they did and how successful or not successful they were in doing so. So you try to learn vicariously from looking at other people as well as from putting into practice some of these things yourselves. Okay, so let's start to look at the definition. Any questions on that so far, guys? Fairly straightforward, everybody? All
Yes,
right.
sir.
Okay, cool. Thank you for the feedback. All right, so let's start to look at how leadership is defined. So the word leader can be traced back in the English language to about the 1300s. So that's 12,000 something. And the word leadership emerged in the 1800s. And this is primarily in the English language. Here we're talking about the use of words that spoke to leaders and leadership. Um, Notice, of course, the study is not about Eastern culture and other cultures. It's only about English. Why? Is because we preeminently are influenced by Western thought, especially of this time frame. There were a few formal definitions that existed up to or prior to 1900 to 1929. 1929 is going to be a critical year for us to be following on. We'll start to see some hedge points that come up. By the 1980s, we had lots of development in leadership and the leadership studies. You had 221 definitions found in texts and other publications. You had more than 366 publications on leadership that had nothing, no formal definition of what leadership was, but they were writing about leadership. So defining leadership has always been a serious problem. And of course, um, that creates a problem. Why is it a problem? Because leadership is different in a lot of different circumstances. So, one early definition between 1906 to 1907 defines leadership as the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of control over societal phenomena. So, in other words, here we're talking about the puppet master. That makes sense? Any of you all, anybody here knows a song called The Master of Puppets? Well, it's not The Master of Puppets, it's called Master of Puppets. No? Never heard of a band called Metallica? Interesting. So, the Master of Puppets situation is one where you have somebody behind the scenes manipulating other people to get certain things done. So, this early definition that was put forward by Mumford is quite interesting because at the time that this is probably coming up, a lot of leaders behaved in this kind of manner. They were behind the scenes manipulators of things. In fact, we still have that concept about certain people who are really in power. You know, we talk about the people, the financiers behind the political power, the outside there, who are really the string pullers. They're the ones who are manipulating things to get things done in a particular way that suits them. You follow what I'm talking about? So, very sinister type of definition, whether it's true or not. All right. Newer definitions, or what we call contemporary definitions, look at leadership from a different perspective. Again, if we look at the situation, hold on, guys, let me just turn off these notifications here. Newer definitions look at leadership from the context of us working together, utilizing a highly ethical environment to get things done together. So it is described as a relational process that is ethical in nature. Um, One of the major requirements, hearing somebody trying to get in, um, one of the major changes from then to now is the emphasis on ethical values. That's something that we do have to pay attention to. Cruikshank is having some issues. Okay. Sounds like they're having, or it looks like they're having network issues. Are you guys hearing me clearly or am I distorting? Because it might mean my system is slowing down here.
I can hear you, sir.
Everything's okay? All right, maybe Cruikshank is having issues. Let's monitor that. All right. All right. So really, we moved away from the concept of thinking that leadership is about one person influencing others, as opposed to a group of us working together to achieve a known goal, not a hidden agenda. All right. So that's the kind of situation that we want to look at. Um, we in developing some of the later techniques or theories of leadership, we are actually going to be leaning heavily upon anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, and that type of stuff. So there's a lot of disciplines that are utilized in the development of the more modern theories that we're going to look at over the time frame that we're going to be observing. Now, um, so we know there is not one correct definition of leadership, and this causes us to return to the question: what is the purpose of leadership? In deciding the definition that best fits is given by the context. So, in other words, leadership varies based upon where it's being applied, and that is something that we have to pay attention to. Um, in wow, let's try that again. Welcome back, Cruikshank. This is strange. All right. Another interesting methodology that was utilized in trying to find definitions for leadership is utilizing metaphoric definitions. Anybody willing to explain to me what is a metaphor? Ariel, what's a metaphor? Any English majors here? Or go ahead, Ariel. See your mic open, but not hearing you. All
So
right.
are you hearing me now?
Yes, hearing you now.
Okay. A metaphor. So it's, I don't know, I guess kind of like a figure of speech maybe.
A figure of speech. Wow. Okay. Um, do you know what a simile is?
A simile, yeah, a word that I haven't done English in a long time, sir. So a word that is similar to another word. Yes.
Okay, so I remember this. No, it's not similar to another word. That's what was the word for what is the word for that? But a simile is
Synonym.
a cinnamon, right? That's what that is. But what is a simile, Christian?
Um,
A
a figure
comparison using.
as I would say a figure of speech with two or more.
Where you all get this figure of speech nonsense from?
A simile is comparing two things using like or as.
Right, so it's a direct comparison. So what's a metaphor and how is it similar?
A metaphor, it compares two things that don't really correlate or
Right,
like it's not alike. So if you say you're drowning in work or something like that, you're not literally drowning.
right. So it's a comparison that is not fully stated. You follow me? So a simile is a comparison using the words as or like, whereas a metaphor is a comparison that's not fully stated or one that is implied. So when we use a metaphoric definition for leadership, it's not that we're saying they are a competitive market or that they are a democratic um, um, system, but they are being compared to these ideas for clarity of understanding. So when we use the competitive market metaphor, what we're looking at is leaders being competitive, and the best person rises to the top. That makes sense in terms of what is leadership.
Yes.
At right collective bargaining, where the most why is Umula still in the guest room, spinning and spinning? Wow, that's problematic. All right. So the number of different metaphors that were developed over time to try and understand or try to get an understanding of what leadership was in terms of definition. So the one that I wanted to pick out from this is the metaphoric example that utilizes music because for me it's one of the things that kind of appeals to me. A common contemporary metaphor likens leadership to an orchestra or symphony. So here we have a picture of an orchestra in action. Who are we looking at there as the leader of that band of musicians?
The conductor.
Children.
The conductor or the maestro? Yes, as somebody pointed out earlier today. Right. So look at the amount of people that he has under him instructing, um, generally pointing, bringing up their pieces. Now, based upon the conducted language that he's going to utilize, he's going to speak to timing, volume, um, emphasis, dynamics of the music and stuff like that. So what he does there kind of guides what everybody else is doing. So Dupree in 1992 uses a jazz musician metaphor because an orchestra is a massive, hundreds of people operating together. So a jazz music is a little less problematic in that the unit is going to be smaller. Anybody here has ever played in a band or performed with a group of individuals in one form or the other in a
Yes, sir.
band? Yep, who that? Who?
Naya.
Right. So, what context was it? What type of performance was it?
Um, it was a musical performance.
Well, okay. When we say musical, what will you do? You were a musician playing an
I
instrument,
was no, I was singing.
right? So you were a vocalist in a group.
Yeah.
And what other members made up the group? Other vocalists, or were there music?
It had another vocalist,
Mhm.
a guitarist, a drummer, and I think that's about it.
All right. So well, you had to have a basis or something there too to help keep some of the basic rhythm together. All right. What was the context of your performance?
It was a Mother's Day performance in school. My secondary school had a Mother's Day program, and we performed.
Were you the lead or secondary vocalist?
The lead,
Wow. What did you perform? What
All
song?
of Me by John Legend.
Wow. For your
Yeah.
mom? Wow.
Well, so it wasn't my
That's
song choice.
that's a provocative song for Mother's Day.
It was not my
Yeah.
song choice. I was just asked to be the lead.
Yeah. See how far we distance ourselves from that song choice. All right,
Yeah.
but think about it from that context. Anybody else has a musical experience or musical background? Um, Not necessarily performing, but at least working with other musicians. Nobody else,
So I was in a choir in school.
right? That similar, similar. What kind of choir,
We used to sing for the church when we used to go to church in school.
right? Okay, that's good, excellent. And that would have a number of other vocalists, probably one or two instruments, maybe a guitar, maybe a piano.
It was most piano and sometimes guitar.
Right. Okay. So you were accompanied, but the main focus of a group like that would be voices and blending the voices at different levels. What voice did you um well what part did you sing?
It was alto.
Alto. Okay. Very good. Interesting. Anybody else can recognize or can identify with something along those lines?
So I played pan.
Right. Similar. Similar. Well, how big was the pan side, Shonique?
Relative small,
When you say small,
about
10,
15
15?
people.
How much?
Yeah,
15?
15.
Right, but
Yeah.
that's a small group, but that meant that maybe you had, um, well, in a small group, each individual becomes more critical because you're holding on a bigger part, right? What pan did you play?
Yes. Double tenor.
Right, so you were just behind the single tenors, or did you not have single tenors?
Yeah, we had single tenors.
Right. You had one or two. Usually it's one in a small band.
There was two.
All right. When they had to play unison, correct?
Yes.
Right. So your job as a second tenor was to do what?
It was more like harmonizing.
Correct. Right. So it's like what we call in the musical sort of like double stops. So you were harmonizing with what was going on in front of you, and then what was happening behind you would be the guitar pans, the cellos, and the bass. Correct?
Yes.
Right. So the other voices in the pan were creating this platform under which the over which I should say the tenors and the seconds and the double seconds would be performing the melody lines. Correct?
Yeah.
Right. So the main melody was played, and then you have to play the harmonizing melody to it. Correct? So you
Yeah.
start to get an idea of the complexity. Who was the arranger and leader? A teacher or
Yeah.
somebody?
Sure.
A teacher. Yep. And they played or
Yes.
they listened and conducted.
Well, she plays tenor as well. So initially she started off conducting and then she joined in after.
Right. Once she could get all the pieces working together. But
Yeah.
why is it important that she stood away from the band to listen to everybody?
So that she could hear how everything comes together and just
There
make
you
sure that
go.
everything.
So think about her in the form of the this person here. Yes, the conductor. Make sense?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So think about this. Regardless of which individual you speak to in terms of the choir or the performance for the Mother's Day or the pan player, the leader of that band must first off choose music that is appropriate. Right? Right, Naya?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate that it wasn't my song choice.
No, but I guess at the time that was chosen was very popular too, a
Yeah,
popular
that's
love
true.
song, right? So we have to think contextually as well. But in hindsight, that's not a song I would really use as a Mother's Day celebration. Although maybe if her partner was singing that to her, that was a bit different thing altogether. But not children. Anyway, coming back to marriage. So they find the right music, they find the right musicians, and of course they have to perform in a public setting. And then that performance is affected by the environment, and then we have to think about other things like the environment includes things like the stage, the sound system, the support structure that's in place, making sure all the instruments are properly tuned, especially when you come to pan, because that's something that has to be done before um, you get to the stage. It has to be properly tuned, as opposed to other instruments that you could work on the tuning on the stage itself, like a guitar or piano and such. So those are lots of other things. Then they have to be cognizant of the people that are playing in the band, the volunteers. The need for everybody to be really good as their individual performance, but also being able to work with each other as a group, because you can have the most talented people playing in a band together, but if they can't get it together, it's not going to sound good. All right, I've listened to some really talented people try to play music together, and it was absolute rubbish because nobody was giving each other any sort of space to work in. So the band leader has a lot of responsibility, and that results in the outcome that we're looking at. So the metaphor that we're utilizing here is really a nice, powerful metaphor to look at the complexity of what a leader is or leadership is all about. That makes sense? So you all understand the metaphoric definitions that were popular at any particular time? Yes? No? Maybe? Not sure? All right. So another metaphor, and I spoke about this one earlier, is something called leadership as an episodic affair. And what that really speaks about is that if you're in a leadership position, it doesn't mean that every minute of every day you are leading. It means that you are going to engage in some leadership activity at different times and different circumstances. So let's say, for example, you're the leader of our organization, and we spoke about this before when we spoke about managing and leading. Some of the activities that you're going to engage in are going to be leadership oriented. That will be, hosting meetings, opening discussions, counseling individuals in your organization, and so on. But some of the other activities you're going to get up to are not going to be anywhere near leadership. It's going to be functional. It's going to be administrative. It's going to be, making sure that everything's in place for you to be able to perform your job or for people to be able to do their jobs. So it's episodic in nature, and 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, a half an hour here, based upon what you're actually getting into. So that the concept, another metaphor, is that leadership is an episodic affair. Refers to that particular kind of um, constant. So people do leadership episodically. 10 minutes here, half an hour here, 15 minutes now, and 2 hours later, then they engage in something. So this is what we talk about in all contexts. Now, here you could be working in community. Any of you all here volunteer? Do any volunteer work in your society around you? Excuse me. Participate in church-oriented stuff or religious-oriented stuff, church
Yes, sir.
groups, right? Who's that? Who's the yes sir there?
I
So you're still with your church group?
um it's not a church group. It's
What is
in
it?
the mosque.
In the mosque,
But yeah.
right? So temple-oriented, yeah. Okay, good. No worries. Same thing. And what types of activities do you all get up to?
We do fundraisers for people in need in the community.
Right.
We do like cleanups
Good.
in the mosque as well as in the community.
Right.
We do outreach programs and stuff like that as well.
When you say outreach, what do you mean?
Like to encourage people
To
to
come
come
to
to the
mosque?
masjid, to pray,
Yeah.
to find a relationship with God, that kind of stuff.
Okay. All right, that's interesting. Anybody here from a non-Islamic background that gets involved with that in terms of their church groups and stuff? Or we just have a bunch of heathens? Looks like we have a bunch of heathens. Trust me, heathenism works. All right, nobody else willing to share. Okay, so is anybody here involved in anything besides just study and work? Um, Although that might be a little unfair at this point in time because I guess the amount of study that you're dealing with is a lot at this point in time. All right, so let's leave that alone for a little while. So, we've agreed that leadership is a complex and elusive phenomenon. We have multiple disciplines that are utilized to try and examine the what it is and how it works. So, as a result, coming out of this, we have a lot of theories that were developed to try and explain this critical element that we're talking about here. Um, a lot of them, however, are, as we will see, have shortcomings and there are a lot of criticisms about them. And one of the things we're going to pay attention to is the context in which they occurred. So these are the theories that we're going to be looking at. Um, these are generally the ones that we're going to pay attention to. There are a few more that exist, and the video will cover that when we get to it. But we're going to go through these and look at the context in which they start to come up. So the first theory, one of the earliest theories, is the great man approach. All right. Um, this theory emerged during the period of the dominance of Charles Darwin. So Darwinism thinking dominated the first theories of the 19th century under the assumption that leadership is based upon hereditary properties. So here we're talking about leadership emerging because of your bloodline. And that basic concept is that where there was a great person, their brothers and children will become the next line of leadership. And in order to safeguard that blood, we had to ensure that the blood remained relatively pure. That pureness of blood, oftentimes in European society led to intermarriage between in families. So cousins got married to cousins, and unfortunately sometimes sisters and brothers, and had children, which led to some genetic issues, and later on that tend to weaken it. So the idea is very simple. Great men passed on these genetic values, or these qualities from one leader to the other. Now, have any of you all ever looked at the Viking series of films of what do you call those, television series by chance, or the Game
So
of
I watched
Thrones?
some episodes, not all.
All right, but the Game of
Yes,
Thrones,
sir.
have anybody's a Game of Thrones person?
Yes, sir.
All right. So you'd notice something about those things. The power resided with a particular family, and that family was always going to be concerned about an heir coming to coming to power later on. And in fact, if you wanted to kill out of any particular lineage, you had to kill all of the men from the family. And that's because the theory of the great man theory is that men could only be great. You couldn't have great women. So when there were such things as great women in existence, they were simply ignored by the theory. Again, you'll find that a lot of the early thinking in leadership is um, very male oriented, and that's actually one of its problems that we'll see later on. So the aristocratic class was always going to be seen as being superior to that of the lower class. And of course, the aristocrats believed themselves to be superior and more worthy than those who didn't come from that. You see that in a lot of films depicted, but the reality was probably a lot more harsh, because people did behave in that manner that you see portrayed on some films, where you cross an aristocrat and you could get yourself punished and killed for doing as little as mistakenly touch them, and that it's a really horrible thing um, that came up there. And of course, the whole issue of power and influence coming only from your lineage doesn't really speak well to whether or not these leaders actually were qualified to do the job that they were bringing to. Now, eventually, that thinking gave way to the early 1900s of the traits approach. So they moved away from the concept of only one bloodline having this leadership. Any of you all ever read the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, or looked at that film with Tom Hanks, um,
The
Da
Da
Vinci
Vinci
Code?
Code.
Yeah, that actually sits on that whole great man theory thing, huh? Because that speaks to a bloodline in existence, and that has to do with the blood of Christ, and that bloodline existing. And well, eventually you saw what the whole issue was, that the Holy Grail was the girl that he was working with, who turned out to be, according to the film, the last, what was it again? The last descendant of Jesus Christ. Yes? You all followed that film? No? And that's what the whole Holy Blood and Holy Grail was all about. You all ever watched that film? Um, oh God, remind, what was the name again? Oh,
The Da Vinci Code.
the Da Vinci Code. Had you ever read the book, or looked at that film? Listen, if you haven't, go and look at the damn thing for me, please. That's your homework. Go and look at the Da Vinci Code. All right. It is actually based on the a book that came out in the early 70s about the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And it was supposed to be an expose written about the actions of lodges, especially the Rosicrucianists and the Crusaders, the Templars, and that type of stuff. So a lot of history involved with it that you could go check out. Anyway, coming out of the 1900s, the great man theory gave way to traits theory. Similar thing here again. There's a couple of traits that individuals had to possess in order to be seen as leaders. Now, this is what you're looking at. It assumed that leaders had a particular trait, such as a certain level of intelligence or education, height, self confidence that differentiated them from non leaders and thus made them successful. Research, however, failed to produce this list of traits, and therefore that trait theory started to diminish over time. Now, what they're not talking about here, they didn't approach it in the textbook, was the emergence of a very, when the great man theory and this traits theory emerged, this was um, reinforced by even through Darwinism in an area called eugenics. Anybody's familiar with what that is? Eugenics.
Yes, sir.
What Garcia do you see eugenics as? Can you explain it just a little bit, or what at least what you understand from it?
What I understand by it was sort of like a breeding project where they're trying to find the best genes to sort of create a perfect race.
Very good. And that phrase, the perfect race, was something that was used by certain leaders at that time and led to worldwide annihilation of populations that were seen as being less suitable. All right. So eugenics actually is something that to this day still rears its head now and again, where certain people postulate that there are people who are not worthy of being called people. They're actually second class citizens or second class humans. And that harkens back to a time frame when, during the justification for slavery, where they would have indicated that Africans were subhumans and they were not as intelligent. Same thing with anybody coming out of Asia. That's why the term Mongoloids came out. Um, Mongolians coming from that particular thing, and they were all seen as different and not equal to the traits that we started to identify. Because some of the traits they didn't state in the textbook that were understood from the thing was that they were white. First off, they were Caucasian. They were blonde hair, blue eyed. They came from a, a similar lineage of purity of the white race. And this is where we have the whole concept of white supremacy movements and stuff coming up. This is what Hitler based a lot of his movements in the World War II. It was one of the reasons why Hitler wasn't opposed by a lot of more people, was because there was a lot of people that were crossing the States and England and stuff who agreed with this thinking, that there was a group of individuals who ought not to be in positions of power because they were proving to be, dangerous for society, which included Jews. And so that led to the Semitism or anti-Semitism movements that we saw take place in that during that time frame. To this day, there's still a lot of anti-Semitism that takes place in our society, in the world around us. I mean, we still have that whole um, problem in the Middle East that originates or resonates with this type of thinking. So again, these theories are born during that period where the prevailing thought was Darwinism. And what was Darwin famous for? The theory of natural selection. So there were certain traits that would maintain survival and other traits that will disappear because, do you all remember the spotted moth thing that they talked that he based a lot of his studies on? Anybody knows Darwin's writings at all? No? No
Yes,
science.
sir, I know some of them.
You vaguely remember that there was a species of moths that he studied that had these spots on it, um, black with white spots. And what happened was they were able to camouflage themselves in the woods and therefore survive. But what happened was that something happened and the forest became, I think, burnt over and they became dark. And the moths would sit on the trees and they would be easily seen. But only the moths that were um, dark or something along those inverted in their spots and stuff like that survived because they were able to camouflage themselves. So the all of the other version got eaten up by the birds and predators in the time frame, and only those that survived were the ones that had the correct color coordination that allowed them to survive in that particular environment. And that's what he used as a term, or one of the ways in which he saw this natural selection process working, survival of the strongest or the fittest. So this is one of the things that led to the development of these eugenic type of things. In fact, there was a lot of experimentation done during World War II by some of the scientists in Germany along the lines of eugenics, and trying to see what would happen if you mix this and that. And there's a whole set of atrocities that were conducted on people. If you ever interested, you should look back at some of the history and the writing about it. Not so much the film, but go read the text. Go read some books about the Third Reich and how they went about doing what they had to do. All right. Now, obviously, one of the problems with trait theory was that there wasn't this list of traits that they could actually produce that was reliable. So there was no set of physical traits that lent itself to this superhuman type of individual that came up. In fact, it in the long run proved to be untrue. That, of course, led to the emergence of something called behavioral approaches to the study of leadership, and its focus is on looking at the behaviors of individuals in leadership positions that lent itself to success or efficiency, as opposed to managers who weren't as efficient, and so therefore they would function in that particular manner. Now, these theories began to emerge after World War II, so there's a pivot point from 1920s into 1945, 1950s. That period was given over to World War II, and the thinking remained static in the traits approach because of the interruption of the war, and the fact that those particular concepts and ideas sort of remained stagnated at that point in time because of the world war that was going on, basically. Coming out of that, we had the behavioral approaches, more led by psychology and sociology. So let's see what they came up with. So what they were doing was comparing effective and ineffective leadership in primarily industrialized circumstances. So here they were looking at, because coming during the war, we had the emergence of a lot of industries being set up, because you had to produce arms and ammunition and munition and that type of stuff. And a lot of the production was done in factory settings. So in essence, what they were looking at was, in this era of industrialization, um, they were going to look at what were good leaders doing as opposed to bad leaders. And psychology lent itself to that studying of behaviors. So you see this is taking place between the 50s and 60s. All right. So we had a couple of theories that came up, one from Ohio State, one from the University of Michigan. They produced a study that gave out these two behaviors: consideration and initiating. So consideration was described as the degree to which a leader acted friendly and supportive towards their subordinates. And of course, the other one, initiating structure, would be the degree to which a leader defines and structures his or her own role to of subordinates towards the attainment of the group's formal goal. Basically, what you're saying is, in essence, there were two sets of behaviors they're looking at: those that showed concern for the workforce, and those that were focused on achieving the goals of the firm, which is production goals. These two were independent, or they were seen independent of each other, and therefore you could score any amount you could in both. So what they're looking at was the incidence of these types of activities taking place. So picture in your mind this guy in a white lab coat with a checkboard, a clipboard in his hand, pen, and he's taking notes, and he's checking off every time he sees somebody do something like that. Kind of like a mad scientist approach to just observing things. Now, in sociology, there is a problem when somebody sees you observing them, because when they see you observing them, it changes your behavior. That's something that during that period in the 50s and 60s they realized. If somebody can see you acting or doing something, you are likely to change your behavior to suit them. So the observation in fact diminishes the truth of the behavior. So that's something to think about. Any of you all ever saw? Oh, I can't remember the name of this film now, but it's a series that was oftentimes. Lumina's having problems again. Um, a what if series. Have you ever seen that social experiments being conducted on people in public, and they have these hidden cameras trying to capture what, and the whole thing, the whole premise is, what if this was happening? What would you do? It usually tends to take place in American societies. You should check it out. They have some interesting clips on YouTube where they've run these little experiments of what ifs around the country, and they look at different circumstances. So in one instance, for instance, there was this dad berating a son because he came out to him and told him that he was gay, and he started to rough him up in the in a restaurant. What would the other restaurant people do? Um, there was another clip that I saw where a woman was belittling her daughter for something or the other. Oh no, they were belittling another person because, or bullying this person because they had red hair, and kind of, talking down to them and that type of stuff. And they had all these hidden cameras, so you had actors playing specific roles, and these cameras are trying to observe what would the audience, the people around, how they would respond. Those are social experiments. But it's the same kind of thing that was going on here, except here you could clearly see when the person was there observing. So obviously, we know this behavior. If the boss is there, what you have to do? If the boss is present while you're on your work environment, what do you do? Well, think about it. If the teacher is there in the classroom and they left work for you to do, what would you be doing? Come on, somebody must answer this.
You would do the work.
Right. Yes, Chris, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say if you could repeat the question, sir.
Well, the thing is, if you're in a situation where you're given instructions and the person is observing you, and you know that they're observing you, what do you do?
You almost see the real answer, you almost see the answer that I would have do.
I'd prefer you be truthful.
Um, how would I be on the phone? So that is literally how it was during school in Austria. The teacher would have be there in class and everybody on their phone.
Right. Okay. But what would happen if the principals came by?
Everybody would have scrambled to do their work. But teacher,
Right. That's what I'm talking about. Because whichever teacher that was that you were dealing with was ineffective as a leader in that classroom situation. So the only person who actually effected any sort of discipline in the classroom or compliance would have been the principal or some form of authority that the children in the classroom fed. All right. Or respected in one manner, another way to do it. The same thing happens in the workplace. If the boss is around, you look busy. That's basically it. If you're not looking busy, you're not doing your work. So that's the nature of when you have seen observers around the place. But let's look at what these theories started to gather. So another theory that they came up with is something called the two-factor approach, where they looked at concern for people, concern for production. Same sort of which we call a bivariate study. And again, they're simply just looking at how often somebody does something that concerns the people as opposed to that which concerns production. And using this research method, it concluded that effective managers show high concern for people and production. Now, obviously, a finding such as this is inconclusive. Does it mean you have to show balance between the two? No, yes. And that's part of the problem that comes up with theories like this. Michigan studies on leadership included the identification of relationships amongst leaders' behavior, group processes, and measures of group performance. 3 types of behaviors were identified: task-oriented behaviors, relationship-oriented behaviors, and participative leadership behaviors. Those 3, so now, again, get a little tricky now. Instead of just 2, they're looking at 3 variables. And these 3 variables, they'll make the observations and see how much of the activities were task oriented, how much were relationship oriented, how much was it participative. And then they'll start to do some analysis from there. And this is where they're going to use statistical models such as correlation and linear regression analysis and all these types of things to work out whether or not there is an existing relationship. Because as one goes up, does the other go down? They're going to link it to output and look at the effectiveness of this type of behavior in relation to output increases. And they're going to do a whole set of measurement and quantification. And at the end of the day, they hopefully will come up with a theory that says, well, these are the things that leaders ought to do given this circumstance. So let's look at the situation. Main criticisms of the theory. The approaches were too simplistic in trying to look at something as complicated as leadership. That was one of the big things. The majority of research on leaders' behavior ignored situational variables and group processes. So therefore, the results that it produced were inconclusive and inconsistent. So those theories that kind of didn't kind of work. So having noted that they had to pay attention to the context in which leadership was taking place, situational contingency approaches developed where now you're not only going to look at what the leader does, but you're also going to look at the context in which the leader is operating. And that, therefore, is hopefully going to treat with the contextual issue or situation. So, situational contingency approaches again try to map behaviors given circumstances. Contingency theories incorporate situational moderators, moderating variables to explain leadership effectiveness. They emphasize that leadership behavior cannot be explained in a vacuum and therefore elements of the situation must be included. So, in essence, what they were talking about here was those modifying factors. So, if you were looking at production in, I don't know, I don't know exactly because primarily most of this research was taking place in industrialized factories. But I suppose they could also apply it. Right? So if you were looking at running a pool of secretarial workers as opposed or a group of accountancy people or accounting people, what would be the difference in the nature of the treatment of the individuals and the actions that they'll get up to. So those kind of things will obviously be the situational modifiers that you'll have to take in consideration that will help to do that. And two major situational contingency theories emerged. One called the least preferred co-worker model, which describes how the situation moderates the relationship between the leader's traits and its effectiveness. And the second one was the path goal theory, which started to develop something called motivational theory from what their findings were here. Because basically what they were saying is that if an individual's needs and wants are satisfied while being able to satisfy the goals of the organization, if they are both intertwined with each other, then the worker and the leader will get better output from that individual as well as better output across the board. Now, this kind of makes sense. It's motivational theory, sort of carrot and stick behavior. If at the end of the day, if you do all this work for me, you get this income, you get these benefits, then that is going to benefit both of us. You will get the benefit that you want for your personal needs and wants, and the organization will get what it wants in terms of its output of productivity and so on. So that's what that theory kind of eventually path goal theory. So that the pathway to the goal for the organization included trying to make sure that we've put in place the accomplishment of personal goals and needs. So here, this is where Maslow's theory starts to come up. Any of you all familiar with Maslow's theory? Hierarchy of needs? Any of you all familiar with that? Might have met that.
So that is where he basically created like a pyramid
Hmm.
and he put like what is the most important things that a
So,
person should have.
yeah. So, what is the top of the pyramid? Self actualization,
Yeah.
right? And the base of the period is physical needs, food, clothes, food, clothes, shelter, basic things like that. Yeah. So again, see how they're making the relationship here now, and the development of Maslow's theory coming into to being now. Again, we're still in the 50s and 60s. This is because the context is right after post World War II. We're in this major recovery period. It requires a lot of industrialization and industrial growth to be able to drive the economies. So that's the context in which these theories are coming up, post World War II. All right. Now, um, criticisms of the theory. So the theories of leadership included a lack of supporting research, so there wasn't enough work done with it. Unclear association between the commitment and the competence of the subordinates and their levels of the development. So there's some gaps in the theory, in terms of the way in which these theories were utilized. Then we have influence theory. Now, interestingly, influence theory has to do about how um, people become influential in society as leaders. This work started with Max Weber making observations in Germany in the 1924 and 1947. Now, what's significant about this is that this is the beginning to the end of the Third Reich. And he began the observation of charismatic leadership, in the managerial context, to describe a form of influence based not on traditional power or formal authority, but rather on followers' perceptions that the leader is endowed with exceptional qualities. Now, we spoke about this before. This is charisma. It is not the individual himself that does anything for charismatic purposes, but it is what the audience puts on to them or gives to that person. They ascribe to this person almost supernatural qualities of charisma. That's something that is interesting that we have to do. This charismatic leadership was formalized by Robert House in 1977, where by that time he was able to kind of take the work started with Weber and try to put it into another set of testable variables. And what he started to notice, or his observations were, that charisma is attributed to leaders by their followers and is based upon the perception of followers and the attributes of the leader, the context of the situation, and the needs of individuals in the group. So there's something, a sort of unspoken relationship that is taking place here. Now, what made Hitler so successful was the fact that he was able to be all men to everyone at the same time. Meaning that, I don't know if you know that song called "Everything to Everyone." Anybody's familiar with that? Kind of a pop song that was kind of popular in the 90s and 2000s. "Everything to Everyone." Anyway, the idea is simply this: during a period where there was a lot of disquiet in the German society, caused by the outcomes of World War One, because if you remember World War One, those of you who have some sort of historical interest, at the end of World War One, Germany lost that war, and they were made to pay reparations to all of the other countries that were affected by the war, which included Poland and all the other places around them. And that those reparations caused the German people to feel very poorly about themselves because, in essence, they were being punished for the war that they were forced into by the aristocratic class of the German country and the aristocratic classes of those people around. Because World War One was really a war that people got involved with because there was an issue of leadership and ideology over particular ownership and who should be in charge after the fact. So there's a whole set of nonsense that went on with that. But at the end of the day, Germany was in ruin financially and economic. They were experiencing very high levels of inflation to the point that their money was worthless, and they wanted to find somebody to blame. And during that period of chaos, they were willing to shake up the status quo, meaning that they wanted change because that change had to meet their needs. And that's what eventually happened. Um, they Hitler rose to power in those conditions because he was able to utilize his speaking ability to appeal to people by telling them the things they wanted to hear. Who was to blame? How do we get back power? And that's how that whole movement of Nazis moved on and became a political force that eventually took over the government of Germany, and then they voted him in as chancellor for life. They remember that, eh? They voted um, the Adolf Hitler as chancellor for life. That's like that's like we voting somebody here for prime minister for life. What nonsense is that, right? We think about that in hindsight, but that's what they did, and that was because he was able to appeal through being perceived as being charismatic, based upon a combination of events and circumstances that led people to look for him or look to him to find solutions for the problem that they had. So influence theory started to talk about that. Making sense why so much things may have happened, because a lot of people always ask the question, well, why did so many people follow Hitler into this war? Why, if they didn't agree with him? But that was the problem. It's not that they didn't agree with him, they wanted him to fix their problems. And one of the things that they all collectively agreed that was causing their problems were Jews. That's why they had to get rid of the Jews. And along with the Jews, they would have gotten rid of gypsies. There's another group of individuals, people who were not white, which would include everybody basically in the world other than the Aryan race, so to speak. Right? You have to consider what would have happened if he had come across to the New World. All right, so charismatic leadership has received a mixed reviews. And one of the things that comes out from this is too much deference to individual leaders by followers creates the dangerous scenario where leaders misuse their power and deliver a vision with an empty dream. And this has been time and time again when we've come across charismatic leaders in the past. Too often we come across that particular issue. So charisma is an overrated area and a dangerous area that has to be looked upon. It's not that you can't be a charismatic leader, but with charismatic leadership, you have to pay attention to what the person's true motivations are, and not be, get carried away with your emotional swing on things. Something to think about in relation to current situations that face the world today. All right, reciprocal leadership theories. These emerged in the 1970s. Anybody could tell me about what they remember, or any concepts about what life is like in the 1970s? I know my dog is making noise, but I still want to get some responses. What is noted from the 1970s? What's happening in the world, the Western world, and the world stage geopolitically? Anybody? Right, so I'm going to call out some
They had a
term.
lot of hippies.
Very good, right? Well, you hit the nail on the head. Hippie movement, flower power. Did you hear that one before? Flower power,
Yes, sir.
peace movement. Yes. What do you
Yes.
understand by hippies? Come here, Ria. We have no conversation. Leave your microphone open. um, what are hippies?
So they're very free in their
Be-
living and their thinking. They
and
don't really
behavior.
like to follow like a structure. So they're all
Correct.
about living in the now. They're about peace and no war.
Right. Very good, because you had 1970s, you had the Vietnam conflict and so on. So they were anti-establishment. They were anti-war. What else? They were free-loving. So there was a movement of what facilitated that free-loving? Do you think, Ariel?
So maybe music. I don't know.
Well, music was part of it because it became part of the whole revolution that took place during that period of time. But what do you think allowed for the freedom, the sexual freedom that took place during that period of time? Anybody could contribute here, if you know things.
Drugs?
Yes, you had a lot of experimentation with hallucinogen drugs, especially things like LSD. They call it acid. Um,
They
so
had a lot of cults back then forming as well.
right, but things haven't really changed. We still have a lot of cults, but yes, you had a lot of people who had charismatic leadership types of things where they led into cult followings. People like Charles Manson, for example. Everybody knows him. We talked about one of the guys, John, the right, Jim Jones. We have a whole host of them. You have the Moonies. There's a whole host of those guys. But I was asking the question, what do you think led to women feeling comfortable enough to be sexually free?
So it was part of them rejecting the societal norms at
Right.
the
So the
time, so
movement,
to say.
right, the movement towards feminism, the breakdown of marriage. But one thing that led to that in particular is the creation of the pill. During the 1970s, the pill came about, so you had sex without consequence. So you if you were on the pill, you couldn't get pregnant. Remember? Anybody recalls that?
No,
And of
sir.
course, no, you don't remember that. Okay, but that was part of the whole movement that allowed for more sexual, what some people refer to as sexual promiscuity, but a lot of people refer to it as sexual freedom, to be able to express yourself in a physical format. During that period, you also had the impact of a lot of Eastern culture coming to coming into the focus, because a lot of the musicians and thinkers from that time would have gone and visited places like India and China and Japan and brought back some of the Eastern cultural concepts of dualism. You had the concept of um, the trance type behavior, the situations where people would be more considerate of other people. So reciprocal theory, leadership theory, was developed during this period where you had this upsurge of anti-establishment feelings. And these theories tend to focus, as we have here, on the relationship between leaders and followers, and they're working together towards achieving those mutual goals that we had, especially in this case here, in some instances, the mutual goals of anti-establishment goals, right? Moving away from war, anti-war, that type of stuff. Because in a lot of these cases here, you had a great distrust for the establishment. So in that period again of social revolution, you also had coming out of this in the same period you had the civil rights movement coming up coming out of the 60s into this period here as well. So if you think about people like Malcolm X, um, Medgar Evers, and all of the Black Power movement people, the 70s was fraught with all of this type of change taking place as well. So you had the hippie movement, you had the One Love movement, you had the Flower Power people, especially out in San Francisco. You had a gay movement happening there in San Francisco as well, and in California. You had the Black Power movement taking place, the Civil Rights movement. You had a whole set of anti-establishment movements taking place. You had the anti-war movement, especially against the war in Vietnam and so on. All of those things happening, and they're all speaking towards shaking up the establishment and the importance of questioning leaders and not just blindly following what leaders were telling us to do, questioning what they were doing and questioning their reasoning, questioning their thinking, questioning their motivations, and therefore requiring a more sharing of thinking, more sharing in the power between the two. So these theories posited leadership is not just something that the leader does to followers, but rather leadership is a process that meaningfully engages leaders and participants, values the contributions of these participants, shares power and authority between leaders and participants, and establishes leadership as an inclusive activity among interdependent people. Now, this is different to all of the theories that we looked at before, because power wasn't something that was being shared in the previous models that we were looking at. Power resided with the leadership. Um, these theories now start to talk about sharing and the relational theory behind things. So you'd see a lot of what we're going to be looking at is based upon some of these concepts. All right. There's another major element that comes up in this theory, and that is the concern for ethical values. And this is one of the other important developments that come up during the relational leadership development here. So these relational models also focused its attention on what we were doing and whether or not those those things were ethically sound. More importantly, it was a relational technique that helped to transfer or transform, I should say, people participating in an organization from being participants to also being leaders. So you had that journey of cycling through. So you had a whole set of different things that was taking place. Some of these theories are the transforming leadership theory, the servant theory, and the fellowship theory. All of them speak to very similar concepts. So we'll look at them basically. This is McGregor's theory in 1978. Notice the time frame, guys. Transforming leadership is a process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. So we have, again, we're talking about elevating each other. So again, we are looking at helping each other to achieve these goals that we collectively decided are better for us. Leadership in that context appeals to higher ideals such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, and humanitarianism, and not to the lesser emotions such as fear, greed, jealousy, and hatred. And that's a very interesting thing because of late I have found that a lot of the our current leaders play upon our fears of differences or fears of change, of things being worse off in the future if we don't do what I say now. That that's the difference between those types of theories. Unfortunately, we seem to be kind of reverting back to the older systems. So transformational leadership is also going to be one in which there's a great deal of motivation and interaction between both groups, so that we are all looking at one common goal. So again, this is a kind of Eastern Zen type philosophy, where we are all focused on really good goals at the end of the day, and we're collectively getting together to achieve these goals. All right. Power is used to realize common goals and purposes, and not for the purpose of exploitation and manipulation. That's a unique thing, because prior to that, everything was really profit oriented. So this is another thing that's coming up with these leadership programs. We've moved out of the realm of businesses and management, because a lot of the leadership studies in the past focused on production. So now we're talking about things outside of the factory and outside of business, and we're talking about the accomplishment of societal goals of oneness, better societies, better environments. So they've broadened the perception of what leadership and what leaders and organizations can do. A unique aspect of transforming leadership theory is its moral component, and we spoke about this. All of these theories had, and in particular the transformational theory, all of them speak to higher ethical conduct. Again, why is this happening? In the 1960s and 70s, a great deal of distrust existed between those people who call themselves anti-establishment, like the hippies, and those people who were in the organizations and were considered the status quo holders. There's a great amount of distrust because a lot of things were being done without really explaining why they were doing what they're doing. And a lot of times it was done primarily for greed. So you had a lot of negativity being preached from corporate levels. I mean, to this day, we still have those kind of things happening. But this model is speaking about us aspiring towards better, purer behaviors, and being more upfront and honest and trustworthy. So these were some of the theories that they spoke about across the board. These are a couple of the leaders. We've met all of these guys, um, um, and they are also classified as transformational leaders. This is Abraham Lincoln, and he's known for his work in the end of slavery. John F. John Kennedy here talked of his big thing was the transition of what ask not what you can do for your nation, but what sorry, ask not what your nation can do for you, but what you can do for the nation. He's pretty synonymous with that form of trans thing. We talked about Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King before. Roosevelt's here, President Roosevelt, he was interestingly, his transformation was more of an economic transformation because he took the United States out of the what they call the Great Depression into a period of prosperity, and then through the majority of World War II, World War One and World War II, because he was one of the longest standing presidents of the United States. He actually went into a fourth term and he died in that fourth term. And I think Lyndon Johnson, not Lyndon Johnson, cannot remember the name of this guy, but he became the president afterwards who ended and the World War II and kind of ended up things there. But he was transformational in terms of moving the society forward through his bootstrap program and all those type of different programs that he developed in the United States during the period of the Great Depression. This is Mother Teresa. She's indicative of transforming movement in India in particular, where they were treating. Anybody knows her story? Anybody here familiar with her story at all? So in India, there's something called the caste system. Anybody's familiar with that? Show of hands. Do you
Yes,
understand?
sir.
What's the caste system?
The caste system is when you're born into a certain class, so like lower class, middle class, upper class, and you're not able to move up
Right.
or
You have to
down.
stay in your class, and it also
Yeah.
means other things. There's a class of people called the untouchables, right?
Yeah, those are like the politicians
No,
and
no,
basically
no,
like
no,
the
no, no.
important.
No, untouchables.
Oh,
No, untouchables is
what's that?
simply that they were people so low down in the classes, you don't touch them because they were seen
Oh,
as
I
dirty
had the
and
wrong impression then.
yes, the untouchables. What you're talking about is the Brahmin class. Those were the people who were, because the Brahmin class is the highest class in the caste system. Those are the people who are closest to God. So the caste system speaks to your distance from the Godhead. All right. So remember in um, Hinduism, they teach um, reincarnation, and the objective of our life is to go through your lives until you eventually get to a position where you're close to the oneness of God. So the next time you die, you enter into nirvana. You're all familiar with that, right? Anybody? The,
Yes, sir.
right. So and so far it seems that Naya, you're the only person. Anybody else is familiar with this besides Naya?
Yes, sir.
Who that? Didn't see you.
Devika.
All right. And Christian, I see your hand up. Vaguely familiar with this? Okay, your hands up, but I don't know if you could turn on your mic. Anyway, so Mother Teresa actually is known in India for transforming the treatment of these so-called untouchables. They're the very poor, what people refer to the dregs of society. And a lot of them were children and women who were unwed and had children. Of course, they would, because women had very little rights in India. Still have some of those issues going on in today's environment, especially more rural areas. And of course, she transitioned the whole concept of, this is can't be right. These are human beings, and she devoted her life to the transformation of these individuals, treating them humanely, especially when it came to healthcare and looking after them and helping them to develop. So these are transformational leaders simply because of the lives. In fact, she Mother Teresa was given much accolades as a result of that. In fact, they considered her for canonization for to become a saint. I'm not sure where they are with that particular movement. So transformational leaders is often contrasted with transactional leadership. Burns did the same exercise here. So, what is transactional leadership? That is where, I mean, transactional leadership is something we've probably experienced all our lives. This is where, in order for me as a leader to get you to do something, I promise something. So I either offer you a reward or I say, if you don't do this, there's some degree of punishment. So this is sort of motivational theory in action. So if we exchange things that we both value, I get this and you get that, that's a transaction. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, is a type of leadership where we are going to inspire, a leader is going to inspire somebody to want to make changes, to want to do things because we are collectively getting together to do something better for everybody. So it's not about any one person getting any benefits, but we are all benefiting from moving ourselves into a better circumstances. All right. So that's one of the main outcomes of that leadership model. All right. Critics of this model focus on the fact that it lacks a lot of clarity and specifics. So the model itself has some inherent weaknesses, but of course, there's some really critical things that we could look at here. And there are other theories. There are two groups that are going to look at both transactional and transformational. We actually have a debate on that topic. We have servant leadership theory, which in essence, and I'll go through this quickly because some of the video we're going to cover some of these things as well. Servant leadership is the second model in this relational leadership. This is where leaders are servants to everybody else. So in essence, therefore, the leader is serving the organization, is serving the other members in two areas. One, I'm going to serve to help uplift everybody else to be able to get things done. So if you think about this, leaders themselves don't really do the majority of work in an organization. So it is in the servant leadership theory, it is a function of the leader to serve the followers to be able to achieve the goals of the organization. Further, as the leader and server or the servant leader, my job is also to transform other persons in the organization, other followers, into leaders themselves. So essentially, my job is to get rid of myself by empowering other people to become leaders in themselves. All right, and I'm doing this in light of us all achieving significant goals. So the servant leader views institutions in which CEOs, staff, directors, and trustees all play significant roles in holding their institution in trust for the greater good of society, which is the reciprocal nature of this leadership process. So this is an important thing because they don't see themselves as the end all and be all of everything, but as we are just holding this organization, we're holding this place for the next group that comes. So it's actually reminiscent of uh, ancient ancient Indian, plain Indian cultures about land ownership. In fact, Indian cultures in the American Indians, Native Americans, actually don't look at the land as something that they can own. It is in trust with them for the next generation. So it is their duty to look after it to ensure that the next generation can enjoy its benefit as well. So, similar thing in terms of the servant leadership model. This model is those people who are placed in leadership roles in this organization are holding this organization in trust for those to come in the past. So it is my job to make sure I maintain the organization, I make sure it's producing well, but I'm also given the responsibility of ensuring that those who have to do the job of getting things done have all the tools necessary, all the motivation necessary, all the resources necessary to get the job done. So my job is to serve them. Without them, the organization doesn't move. Further, I am also going to be in charge of ensuring that these people develop. So there's a certain amount of education that has to take place, training and so on, so that they themselves can in turn take over my role in the future. So it's so like succession planning across the board. All right. So I think if we get this, this is the main kind of idea that comes up between the servant leader model. So if let's look at the followership model, a very similar model again. This is 1992. Kelly talked about redefining followership and leadership, rejecting the industrial model that we talked about coming out in the 50s and 60s. Here we're talking about the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. The followership or the relational leadership models become more popular and get more traction, basically, in the study systems that we're going to be looking at, or the models that are coming out there. So again, similar thing where where leaders are there to engage with followers and move everybody towards being an active follower. So we talked about this here, effective followers. The job of the leader is to move people into the effective follower status. We looked at this model from the previous presentation from the Kelly model before. So we saw that. So we have to encourage critical thinking. We have to encourage action and not passive behavior. We have to get them to think and move them towards being effective followers. That's the job of the leader in that model. All right. So followers have, to manage themselves well. They're committed to the organization. They build their competencies and focus their efforts on maximum impact. They're courageous, honest, and credible. So that's the nature of followership there. All right. Um, so let's leave the leadership theories from that part here, um, and start to look at where we're transitioning to now, and this one is not dealt with. So first off, we're leaving off the industrialized paradigm that most of the leadership models prior to the relational leadership theories were developed, to models that look at the 21st century moving forward. So this here really speaks to what the paradigm of leadership was sitting on, or the paradigm of the industrialized things is sitting on during the period of industrialization. So in 20th century, the industrial era is that in that the theories were structurally all right. So I'm doing this badly. So what's happening here is that the theories that were developed in leadership were sitting upon the understanding that the world around us was structurally functionalist, management oriented, personalistic in focus, only on the leader, goal achievement dominated, self interested, and individualistic in outlook, male oriented, utilitarian, and materialistic in ethical perspective, and rationalistic, technocratic, linear, quantitative, and scientific in language and methodology. So this is the context in which the industrial theories of situation content, all those other theories looked at with the bivariate evaluation and all of those theories, they're really just focused on looking at the world like a factory, as an industrialized environment. Even the education system that developed came out of that industrial functionality, thus the comprehensive and secondary school systems that exist to this day. In most, well, in our country in particular, but in most European nations, they have moved away from that comprehensive education approach to one that's a lot more flexible, encouraging critical thinking and creativity. That's an important translation that takes place there. Less emphasis on testing and more emphasis on learning. So those are the kind of things that's happening. But this is the paradigm under which the majority of the theory that we looked at was developed. The reality is that in the era of the reciprocal development, we find that the shift here is away from that thinking of the industrial circumstance and thinking more of the world as it really exists, we need to be working together to deal with the problems that are facing us, because the problems that are facing us now is one of constant and rapid change. Let's think about um, the pandemic situation that we faced. That was an enormous amount of change that took place in a very, very short space of time on a wide scale. We talk about worldwide. Worldwide, we had to make these massive changes in the face of incomplete information. And of course, we had to deal with all of those circumstances. So this is what Slocum and Luthans was talking about here. Faced with an unprecedented economic, technological, socio-political, and moral, ethical, tumultuous sea of change, there is a need for new theories, new application, and just plain new thinking about leadership. So how did leadership respond to that pandemic challenge, how did leadership work towards facing the reality that we had? You'd see that a lot of different things were done during the process that we were dealing with, where people were brought to the forefront to answer questions and level with people what was going on. Being honest was an important element across the board. So the problem is that most of us have been taught that the world is a neat, controllable environment. And we know from experience that this is not true. Now, how many of you have any form of OCD? By a show of hands. That do you perceive now that I don't think anybody here has been medically tested for that. But how many of you all feel that you have some level of OCD? I will put my hand up one time because I tell you I have OCD. Right, right, and OCD means we have an obsessive compulsion to making sure that certain things are in a particular manner. Just right, so great, Miss Garcia, Christian, great. The problem we face is that the world around us has doesn't subscribe to our position, but we are able to control the small environmental space around us. And once they are in our to our liking, we're comfortable. So we create this little niche in this confusion around us. The world around us is a massive amount of confusion. It's not neat. It's not controllable. We have very little control over what's taking place. When it becomes a compulsive disorder is when it is we are unable to function normally in these controlled or these changing environments. The problem with it is that most times we are taught that the world operates in these nice neat silos of behavior. The reality is not so. All right, the world is vague. It is not black and white. It operates in shades of gray. World order is I don't know, it's a fallacy. All right. So we have to really think about a way in which theory can be developed to to help us to navigate our way through this morass of change that's taking place. All right. Um, we can't fight the change or we can't fight the chaos. We actually have to navigate our way through the chaos. And one of the first things is that we have to recognize that chaos is a natural thing. So here we're getting into the world of chaos theory. Um, there are books and a thing and things about it. I don't know if anybody ever heard about the concept of a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil and on the shores of Brazil and causing a hurricane in the other side of the hemisphere. You all ever heard about that? That whole concept of small actions having massive repercussions later on. There are lots
Yes,
of
sir.
yeah. Okay, so those are part of the things. Some small indecipherable action in one area has disastrous impact in another area. That's the whole concept of what chaos is. But the whole problem that we have is navigating change is always going to be problems because why? We get accustomed to the way the world is and we feel comfortable in it. We operate well in that environment. But the problem that we face is we don't operate well when we are forced to change and change very rapidly. All right. So chaos is defined as order without predictability. And this is the thing about it is that though it looks like chaos, there's actually a hidden pattern. And it's important for us to look for that hidden pattern to be able to deal with it. So there are two elements that we have to look for. The first thing we have to do is we have to pay attention to what is called the initial or initiating circumstances. What started the change? Okay, and we have to accept that we can't really control what's taking place, but we have to pay attention to what started the situation. All right. Um, So this is what that was referred to as initial conditions. What is the initial conditions? Pay attention to that, because that in that will we will find an eventual end position. And interestingly enough, that is something that oftentimes comes to bear. So we have to pay attention to what caused it all, and then we have to understand the importance of anding or andness. First off, andness in terms of we cannot tackle this alone. We have to work with others to tackle the problem. Anding literally means we have to work with other people. So a lot of us see ourselves as silos. We're capable of doing our own work. Um, I prefer, a lot of people here prefer to work individually rather than with other people, because there's less problems, there's less conflict. And that's something that you all are going to have to treat with, because I'm going to force you all to have to work together in groups. And the reality of it is that life is going to force you all together to work with each other. If you ever look at any movie that has um, any sort of chaotic activities, so some sort of um, uh, like Walking Dead and that type of stuff, it's all about this chaos. And with that chaos, you have a group of individuals who have these dynamics that get together and try and navigate their way forward and survive. So it's the same kind of thing. They didn't get together and survive only because of one individual, but by the fact that they got together and worked together towards a goal and an accomplishment. Leaders emerge out of in those organizations or in those particular circumstances, and those people then, become, they move on. Other leaders emerge, and you have different types of situations and circumstances that come up. Um, so that ending is important. Not only that, we also have to be aware of looking at the both and not either or. Simply meaning that a solution to a problem is not this or this. We have to start to think about something might be both right and wrong simultaneously. So that's a little complicated or a little um, difficult for some people. How can something be right and wrong at the same time? And this is where we have to think about it, because it's right and wrong based upon perception, circumstances, and understanding what is taking place if one is to try and apply some of these solutions going forward. Because the concept now of being right and wrong at the same time is not something that's easily acceptable, especially in our um, black and white circumstance or black and white perception. Especially if you have OCD, it's either right or it's wrong, and that's not true. Some things are right, some things are right in sometimes, and some things are wrong sometimes. They're not right all the time, and they're not wrong all the time. And the conclusion that we have to come into this is that sometimes it is better for us to find a solution utilizing different people's perspectives and find partial solutions from all of these different approaches to the thing that will eventually give rise to a possible solution moving forward. So it's not only one person's view or one person's or one individual's options, but a number of partial solutions to eventually get us to where we can move forward out of the chaos or into a more settled situation. So that's where the anding element comes up as well a second time. So we have to and things, we have to think about it beyond right and wrong. We have to think about it from being um, yes or no. We have to think about, well, maybe some of this would work and some of that would work. Pull those elements together, we could get something out of it. So in that chaos, you have to actually use some even more chaotic approaches. Now the problem with this technique or approach is that it's vague. Um, Unnecessarily so, because if you really think about it, I mean, what eventually moved us out of the pandemic was a combination of nemesis of things. We had vaccines coming from one particular country and a number of different vaccines coming from the other place. How did they arrive at those solutions? They use different approaches, different techniques. Then how did we manage with what's going on, and then what happened to the world around us after the fact? All of those kind of things. I mean, this class is a result of that. We've moved into this online environment because of our reaction to what took place in that circumstance. And we have stayed this way because, as a population, you all have unanimously told us stay online. We have tried in many occasions to bring classes back onto face to face, but the vast majority of our students want to stay on an online environment. Why is that, Christian or Darren? Why do you all want to stay in the anonymous online environment? Any one of you can answer. How about Danielle? Or Devika? Come on, somebody answer. Must have an
So
opinion.
because so because when you're home and you're in your comfort of your home, you just go on your phone and thing. You have the freedom to get up and walk out. I could just walk outside, and you just have that comfort home.
So learning is more comfortable in the home environment. That's what you're saying.
I would say yes, but I would also say the freedom to go on your phone and be able to just get up and go outside and do those stuff, like do
Mhm.
anything, you could just do it at home. So
So you could kind of multitask. That's what you're saying. All
yeah.
right. All right. So you could do more than one thing, especially if Sir is being boring as hell, right? Going through chaos system and kind of rubbish here.
So I never say that, sir.
That's
I never say that.
I am telling you that.
so just to
Uh-huh.
add to the discussion, at
Yeah.
least for me, from like a personal standpoint, I prefer the online classes because I am working, and I mean, when you're coming from an 8 to 4 to then try to rush to a class for 5 o'clock and have to settle in, and you're kind of disoriented because you're sitting down in traffic, or you're probably stuck at the office where you could just log in on your phone and join the class. It's just a
Right.
lot more
User
accessible.
friendly. User friendly and accept. Very
Yeah.
good. Those are the reasons that we captured. Yes, Adissa. Cruikshank. See your hand up. If your hand is up, you need to open your mic to speak. Huh? Remember that.
Sorry.
Okay. All right, you closed off again. We okay? All right. All right, but I understand because we had sort of spoken to people before to find out what was going on, and yes, but from my perspective as well, I don't have to go racing down to Port of Spain every day, fighting up with traffic to get into an office to sit down there and well, sit in traffic, then sit in the office to do work. I'm home. I could roll off my bed a little later, be more restful, put in more. That actually has become more of my problem, balancing my time at work and my actual leisure time, because that has become a bit of a problem across the board because I end up working too much, which is to the benefit of the organization and to students, but at the same time it's has this negative impact on me as well. So I have to kind of balance those things out. So balance is going to be one of the key issues that we're going to be looking for across the board, which again, chaos systems really speak about. So another form of leadership, and it's one of the last ones I'm going to look at here, is a form of leadership called authentic leadership. Um, Authentic leadership sounds very nice, and it is one of those leadership models that is really going to call upon authentic behavior. So it calls upon especially very high um, ethical values being followed by everybody in the organization, but more so in the form of the behaviors of the leaders, because it has been past failures in leadership, or I should say breakdowns of ethical values by other leaders that has caused the popularity of this particular model to arise in our society, or one of the models that we have to look at, because we've had the Enron, we have the Bernie Madoff. In our case here in the Caribbean, we had What's that guy in St. Vincent? Is it uh, the guy who started this whole T20 nonsense? Cricket. Um, Name starts with N. Stanford, I think it is. Am I right, guys? With the 220 cricket, he invested a lot of money in the creation of setting up the T20. Nobody's familiar with this guy. Anyway, all of these people were in positions of leadership, and they actually ended up creating situations where a lot of distrust was created as a result of their abuse of the system. You had Enron, you had Bernie Madoff, you had all these pyramid schemes that came up, and people lost their life earnings in it. Then we had the collapse of the financial systems into the 2008. And by 2010, we had fallout taking place around the world. In Trinidad, we had the whole nonsense with the Clico Financial, the Hindu Credit Union, and all that type of financial failure taking place in our systems. And that is where leadership was looked upon as being, very selfish in nature, very profit driven, and that form of selfishness and greed is what has led to the development of authentic leadership as an alternative. So these two individuals, Luther and Alvolo, they describe authentic leadership as the confluence of positive psychology, transformational leadership, and moral, ethical leadership. The authentic leader is someone who is confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral and ethical, future oriented, and gives priority to developing associates to be leaders. That's a tall, tall tale. It's the ideal that we would love to see in organizations and in leadership around us, not only in private sector but also in government. How closer to this we could get, the better we would be as a population, as a nation, as people generally. Um, the problem I have with this theory is that it's so idealistic that it's hardly likely to be realistic. But the one good thing about having very high ideals or idealistic systems is that it gives us a method of moving towards something that is measurable. We could look at how far away from this goal we are by measuring the gap between it. It's the purpose of theory actually. Theory allows us to compare reality to theory, and therefore it gives us some concept of what the variants are going to be. But across the board, this theory speaks to some very high values of behavior, transparency, in both in terms of thought and action. I mean, here you want people who are inherently transparent in every aspect of their lives. So for me, this really speaks to being kind of what's the word I want to use? Naive almost in thinking that we could get organizations and leaders to behave this way. But again, great idea in terms of moving towards this. But it's a response really to what happened in the recent past in terms of where we've given people all this trust to do things the right things, and we've been constantly seen to be at loggerheads with these people because they always turn out to be crooks, stealing people money. So you see all like Wolf of Wall Street is one of the elements that looked at with that. Catch Me If You Can is another film that you could see that in. Um, this film about the girl with the blood, the drop of blood. That's another film where you could see this taking place. There were films made up, too big to fail. Um, was another movie that was made about the financial crisis and what took place during that period and that whole thing. So you could see a whole the Enron nonsense that took place. That there's a whole set of activities that position itself at why this theory has become, uh, um, you know, really important is because it speaks to a polar opposite to what has existed, and it's trying to encourage the development of authentic leadership across the board. In this model, followers are really important because they are also charged with the responsibility of holding everybody up to this higher ideal of openness and honesty. All right, and everybody has to be in that same authentic behavior across the board. There's no room here for lying. There's no room here for for dishonesty. All right. So everything is about transparency, openness, and trust. Guidance towards only worthy things. We're not only looking, or we're not looking at profiteering at all. We just everything is for everybody's development. Emphasis on follower development. All of these types of things. So again, really good theory, like one that we would could aspire towards, but realistic, I don't think so. All right, so there's a lot of things about this that we could go through in terms of the authentic leadership model coming out of the chaos theory. So there's a lot of things, and I'm going to bother to go through because I think the 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 summary that we're going to look at in a little bit is going to be useful across the board. So one of the things that we went through a lot of theories today and approaches. There are two things I want you to pay attention to in that. One, don't go and learn these theories. It's not relevant. The theory that we have to focus on, we're going to deal with next week. Two, pay attention more to the context in which the leadership theory is developed. So just like the authentic leadership theory we talked about here, this was a reaction to what took place in society, in the general society outside there, where there was this absolute loss of general trust in the leaders around us that created this need for us to find this reaction, say no, we don't want these kind of leaders anymore. We want authentic leadership. So you'd notice the leadership that we started with, the traits, the great man theory and the leadership theory, they reflected the general thinking of the time period. That, of course, led us into the eugenics and the development of that whole concept of some people are more equal than others. For those of you that who know, that's a Animal Farm reference. Um, and then we moved through the 70s and the 80s, where we went into the relational leadership model, and we had the whole one love movement and the hippie movement and the rock and roll revolution and all that type of stuff taking place that went against status quo and shaking up the powers that be, so to speak. So those are the kind of things I want you to focus on. Focus on the context in which theories develop, because oftentimes you'd find, especially with behavioral theories and with social sciences, the context of thinking at the time influenced a great deal of what the scientific disciplines come up to be. So that's something we have to put together. So those are the things that I want you to pay attention. There's no need for you to go and memorize any of this stuff at all. So let's look at this little video, online video. Let me know if the audio is working, guys, so that so I wouldn't play it if it's not working. So let's look at this here. I think I still have it open. Um, all right, let me know if you're hearing things here properly.
An introduction to leadership theory.
Are you hearing that?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Here is a short introduction to some of the most important leadership theories, trends, and models. These can all be instructive in understanding your own leadership style, broadening your expertise, and giving you tools to improve as a manager. Great man theory. The great man theory is one of the oldest theories in leadership. It is the idea that true leaders, or heroes, are born with the innate ability to shape history. Thomas Carlyle was a historian, and he came up with a theory based on the examples of key historical figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte. However, this premise that leaders are born, not made, has largely been refuted. The main importance of this theory is that it reveals how we have traditionally seen leaders. Carlyle's work also gave impetus to the study of leadership and development of further leadership theories. Control and domination, power and influence. Great man theory was linked to the idea of power and that leaders would naturally dominate others by the strength of their personality. This school of leadership theory is summed up in Moore's definition of leadership from 1927. He defined leadership as the ability to impress the will of the leader on those led and induce obedience, respect, loyalty, and cooperation. The point to note here is that there's no reference to the responsibility of a leader for their followers or to any moral code. It took the extreme abuses of power by the likes of Hitler, Mao, and Stalin in the first half of the 20th century for these ideas of leadership to be properly challenged. Leadership traits and skills. Academics also started to identify the traits of leaders to see what common characteristics made a good leader. In the early iterations of the theory, these traits were also seen as inherited and linked to the idea of the great man, the charismatic male hero who was tall and good-looking. This school of thinking evolved into identifying more positive traits such as integrity, moral courage, and humility. Importantly, there was also a shift towards characteristics that could be developed. As the emphasis moved from innate to acquired characteristics, the focus moved to identify leadership skills and behaviours that could be learned, such as communication, strategic thinking, and decision-making. Action-centered leadership. John Adair's action-centered leadership model was built on the premise that leadership skills and behaviours could be taught and adopted. The simple idea behind action-centered leadership is the need to balance the three core management priorities of task, team, and individual. A good leader must continually seek to achieve the task, build the team, and support the development of each individual. Transactional and transformational leadership theories. James McGregor Byrne took the ideas of influence and behaviour in another direction when he defined the difference between transactional and transformational leadership in 1978. Transactional leadership is management using a carrot and stick approach. This functional style relies on basic human needs such as income and job security. These elements are related to the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Transformational leadership goes beyond transactional leadership. This type of leader seeks to inspire people with a compelling vision and lead them towards self-actualization at the top of the Maslow pyramid. Bernard Bass built on the work of Burns and defined the key behaviours of the transformational leader as being a positive role model, providing encouragement, and supporting followers to fulfill their potential. Situational leadership theory. The situational leadership model, developed by Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard, took leadership theory in another slightly different direction. Their model is about having a flexible approach. It demonstrates how a leader can adapt their management style depending upon the experience of the team and the individuals they are working with, while also considering the environment and circumstances they find themselves in. The leader chooses their approach, either delegating, supporting, coaching, or directing, depending upon the situation. Values-based leadership. Values-based leadership developed in response to various moral failings of prominent leaders. This school of leadership, related to trait theory, encompasses both servant leadership and authentic leadership models. The central idea is that the values-based leader has a strong moral compass and leads according to their personal values and the shared values of their organisation or community. This model stresses the importance of being a good leader, not just a charismatic one, and the ability to make the right or ethical decisions, not just effective or bold choices. Servant leadership theory. The idea of the servant as leader was developed by Robert Greenleaf. This model of servant leadership is primarily about motivation. The servant leader wants to serve others and society by raising up new leaders and helping people to move towards a positive vision of the future. They are not seeking power for themselves. Instead, servant leaders share power and empower others. Toxic or bad leaders. At the other end of the scale, academics also started to identify the opposite of values-based or good leaders. Marcia Lynn Wicker popularized the term toxic leader, and various models have been developed to identify such bad leadership. For example, Barbara Kellerman's study identified 7 types of bad leader. These are incompetent, rigid, intemperate, callous, corrupt, insular, or evil. Authentic leadership theory. The term authentic leadership was first popularized by leadership practitioner Bill George. He wrote a book by the same name in response to failures of senior corporate management, such as the fraudulent behavior that led to the fall of energy giant Enron. George advocated for leaders of purpose, values, and integrity, rather than those motivated by greed and power. George's academic colleagues, Bruce Avolio and William Gardner, then developed models around this concept, identifying the key behaviors or traits of an authentic leader. These included self-awareness and self-regulation, balanced processing of information, relational transparency, and a strong sense of morality. So that is a very quick introduction to some of the key leadership schools, theories, and models. Theory can be a little dry, but understanding these models is important. They help to give us language and concepts that help us reflect on our own leadership experience and the conduct of others. They give us tools to help and to use in our own leadership practice, and they also act as signposts of ways that we can help to develop and grow other leaders. And you can start now. Take a few minutes to reflect. Which of the leadership theories are most intriguing to you? What does this model reveal about your own leadership? Which tool could you apply in the interactions that you have today?
All right, guys, what do you think about that?
It was very informative, very interesting.
All right. So that kind of summarizes everything that we looked at. And it added a couple of dimensions. I didn't talk about the negative or the toxic leaders. Other people in other presentations will be treating on that. All right. So, are there any questions that people would like to ask? As I said before, again, this is really to jog your memory. Think about some of the models that we looked at. Which ones appeal to you? I mean, some of you all might like the chaos theory. Some of you all might like that authentic leadership model. The idea is reflect upon which one appealed to you and see which ones will work for you. I don't need you to learn them. There's no need to memorize them. Just think about it. Ruminate on it a little bit. All right, guys. Any questions anybody wants to ask? No? All right. I will see you guys next week for chapter 3. So I'll pause the recording now.